Okay. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Rabbi Chuck Feinberg, Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. And Interfaith Action for Human Rights represents people of faith who live in Virginia, the District, and Maryland. And our mission is to end policies and practices that promote torture in our society and to counter bigotry directed against vulnerable communities. Our main work focuses on minimizing the use of prolonged isolation or solitary confinement in prisons and jails in our region, ending other abusive treatment in detention facilities, and countering bigotry directed against vulnerable communities and or individuals. Joining me today is Ed Koff, who is the treasurer of our organization, member of our board, has great interest in our issues. And joining us is Malcolm Young, who will be interviewing. And Malcolm has advocated for individuals in America's criminal justice system for more than 45 years. During his career, Malcolm has served as a defense attorney at a community defender office in Chicago. Malcolm helped found and was for 19 years the executive director of the Sentencing Project, which works for fair and effective use of the United States criminal justice system by producing groundbreaking research to promote reforms in sentencing policy, to address unjust racial disparities in practices, and to advocate for alternatives to incarceration. Under Malcolm's leadership, the Sentencing Project became a voice against mass incarceration and for justice reform. In 2005, Malcolm returned to Chicago to direct the John Howard Association, providing public oversight of the state prison, jails, and juvenile correctional facilities. And in 2009, Malcolm was awarded a Soros Fellowship to develop innovative approaches to employment-related prisoner reentry. In 2015, Malcolm developed and launched Project Opportunity to provide reentry assistance to persons whose federal sentences for drug law violations were reduced and for individuals whose sentences were commuted by President Obama. Currently, Malcolm is developing a conceptually new approach to reducing mass incarceration. So welcome, Malcolm. So glad you're here with us.
Thank you.
And I guess I'll start with a personal question. Where did you grow up? Where were you raised and grew up?
I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas.
Okay, a fellow Midwesterner.
Heart of the Midwest, a university town.
Right. Were one of your parents or both your parents involved with the university?
Yeah, my father was a teacher, a professor in the medical school, but engaged in research at the university offices in Lawrence.
And I was wondering, did you have any experiences growing up or as an adult that influenced your decision to become involved in criminal justice work?
Yeah, only indirectly. I mean, I sort of, one view is I fell into this all by accident and fate. I did what many people of my age did. I had to wrestle with what to do about the draft in Vietnam, and I ended up going into the Navy and as an officer and spent some time there. While I was in the Navy, I had the occasion to be a defense officer for someone charged at captain's mast with an offense that was committed on shore. And I didn't realize it at the time. I got into it, I did an investigation, and I found the evidence that should have led to the man's acquittal. And only later did I realize that this was a precursor to the work that I was to engage in as a defense attorney. But I went to law school as an alternative to I didn't know what, and I ended up in criminal justice totally as a matter of accident. It's just the job that appealed to me when we moved to Chicago for my wife's graduate work was in criminal defense, and somehow I found out I liked it.
Got it. Well, you've had such interesting, demanding positions, such as being the founding executive director of the Sentencing Project and providing public oversight of Illinois state prisons and other facilities, and developing Project Opportunity. So I was wondering if you could sketch out what you may have learned from each of these experiences. And did you get a sense of what needed to change in criminal justice? And in what way did those priorities change over years? Maybe that's too many questions at once.
Well, at the risk of having a career that's just a jack of all trades and master of none, um, I would say that what really orients me was the personal involvement with individual clients as a defense attorney. I was fortunate, in fact, to work in offices that had a lot of resources, interpreters, investigators, social workers, consulting psychiatrists. So I was able to see what could be done with a strong criminal defense with good attorneys, and what was revealed about the people we worked for by the social workers and the psychologists and psychiatrists that we worked with. And that carried over into the sentencing project, which was policy related, and continued on through until the last project you mentioned, Project New Opportunity, which again dealt with individuals coming out of the federal system. And we got the opportunity to look close up at what each person that we worked with, what their life history was, what their present situation was, and what needed to be done to help them get back into their community.
So working with social workers and psychiatrists and other support staff when you were a defense attorney and a public defender, so how did it help you in your defending your clients?
Well, two ways, really. Well, several ways. First of all, again, the offices were richly provided with resources. So not only did we have access to, my first office was a teaching office, a clinical office. So we consulted on our cases, and we listened to the social workers and the psychiatrists and other experts to make sense out of the history that brought the person into court, brought them, was behind the trouble they were in, which was often serious, trouble like homicide. And then second, we learned to be adept in the court system working with social workers who were better able than we were as attorneys sometimes to explain, even to the prosecutor, what was going on with the individual, what was redeeming, what explained certain actions. So we developed the practice of sometimes almost double teaming the prosecutor and informing the court about who this was that was before them. And we got good results out of these offices and programs, which included Northwestern Legal Clinic, which is the last office I was in Chicago. We got great results because prosecutors, judges, other people in the system saw the individual, saw what was involved, and stopped looking at people our clients, as if they were just another statistic or just another case to be handled. And I think to this day, I think we need to get back to that approach to criminal justice.
Are there significant efforts being made to change the nature of the defense bar and the people it works with and the approach it takes?
There's significant efforts, one of the key ones, the Gideon Project, that works with and tries to teach and train criminal defense attorneys and public defenders, but the system's overloaded. There's not enough time to do what I described doing in the cases I worked on. The caseloads are too heavy. There's no expectation of this kind of work from the judges or the prosecutors, so there's no demand for it. The policymakers don't want to pay for it. So it's an uphill battle. The second development, which has affected all of this, is mandatory minimum sentencing and strict guideline sentencing. We were often able, when I started practicing, which was 1974, we were often able to get an individual sentenced well below the minimum sentence by getting the charge adjusted downward. And this became impossible through the years. While I was at the sentencing project, we witnessed the increasing difficulty in getting the courts or prosecutors to exercise discretion and move sentences down. So these two factors, mandatory minimums and step sentences, and the lack of resources, really hamper criminal defense. And I have some more thoughts about that.
So
Be interested in those thoughts.
Pardon?
I said we'd be interested in those thoughts.
Well, you asked what could be done with the criminal justice system to change things. And one of the changes that I would make, if I was able to dictate, would be to follow through on the defund the police movement, not to take the money away from the police per se, absolutely, but to repurpose money that's now being spent literally for arrest and detention policing and put it into services like mental health interventions and diversions, community responses, which, by the way, a number of very thoughtful police really would like to see. Police officers know they're not social workers, and they know that people they're picking up need the intervention of folks who can help them and work with them and get them to change their behavior in a positive way. So this is not actually a radical approach, but it is that the defund the police has really brought this forward in a way that's tangible. People understand, I think, that we need to shift away from just arrest and processing in court. But following through on that, the other innovation I would encourage would be a court process that changes, actually not as drastically as it sounds, but to start a triage process at the first hearings when a person is brought to court. And basically, from my practice and observations, I've observed that for convenience, we'll divide people into thirds, but 1/3 of the cases that come in are going to be thrown out. They're going to be dismissed. Nothing is going to happen to them. We're going to keep people in jail and make them pay a bond, but their cases are going to go away. That's just, the witnesses don't show up, the police decide not to prosecute, whatever it is. So we know if we can identify most of those cases right up front, and we should just get them out of the system and not put them in jail and not put them in the criminal justice system, but put them somewhere else, which comes back to the defund the police argument. If there were places to divert, we had interventions like community justice, restorative justice. This is where these things would come into play. Then on the other end of the system, you have 1/3, again, for convenience. I don't think it's that large. But you have cases that are serious. Someone was hurt, damage was done, and there's a serious question about the legal responsibility and a serious question as to whether the government can prove legal responsibility. So for those 1/3 of the cases, and I think it's a smaller number than that by far, those are the cases that the prosecutors and the defense need to approach as attorneys and get ready for trial, bring the resources of the court system to provide a fair trial. But you've got more resources because you're not cluttering up the court system with cases that don't need to be there. And then last in the middle, you have 1/3 of the cases, roughly. So we don't know at the first hearing what's going to happen. They may be serious, they may not. The person may have been involved, they may not. But investigation, discovery of what the state has against our client, against the defendant, will reveal what kind of case we have. So we should change the current practice from forcing people to plead guilty or face a serious penalty if they push the system, ask for a trial, to allowing people who are arrested and their attorneys to say, okay, we can't decide now what we need to do, but give us the information about what the case is. Let us talk to the prosecutors, let the prosecutors get into the case, and let's figure out whether this is a case that's going to be dismissed, there's going to be a community alternative, or whether it's a case that's going to go to trial, in which case we'll devote those resources to it. So I call this a triage approach, and my feeling is that if a court system adopted something close to this, that you would free up enough cases out of the system that you could put the proper amount of attention in, including from public defenders, into those cases that really merited support and court resources, and get the rest of the stuff out and back where it can be dealt with effectively by people with the training and the orientation to help solve the problem that brought the person into court, whether it's drugs, mental health, um, uh, violent proclivity, whatever it is. Get those people to where they can be helped, and don't let them into a system that ought to be reserved for serious questions of law and fact. So that's my pitch.
I'd like to pick up on one thing you said earlier about mandatory minimums and how that affected the explosion of the prison population. And I suspect the reason that came in was a feeling that that there should be some kind of equality in judgment of people, and that people committed similar crimes should be given the same kind of sentence. And so, therefore, if you did X, you're going to do 15 years, no matter what the circumstances are around it. Just wondering how you would respond to that argument of taking discretion out of the hands of the judges, and which resulted in all kinds of different amounts of time given to people with similar kinds of crimes.
Well, there are two things here, Chuck. There's mandatory minimums, which I think were imposed because lawmakers felt judges were being too soft or too lenient. Right. So they took the decision out of the hands of judges, right, and said, you can only go up from here. And then there's guidelines which were to equalize the sentencing, equalize the penalty. I think, and many of the guidelines actually raised the penalties and took away the discretion to avoid serious penalties. One of the problems is that both of these systems put a tremendous amount of power in the hands of the prosecutor, who decides what an individual is charged with. So you never really got to the equality or equalization of penalties, because the prosecutors were left to individually, without any guidance at all, office to office or even within one office, decide whether someone is going to be charged with an offense that has a mandatory minimum of 1 year or a mandatory minimum of 10 years, etc. So all that being said, I think there is the fear of discretion is irrational, based on a desire to punish and the feeling that judges don't punish enough. But I don't see what's wrong with the exercise of discretion, because you really want, and again, this is what I'm talking about, how the trial system, how the court system should be working. You really want to invite in every opportunity to solve the problem in any other way than by sending a person to jail or prison. You only want to send people to jail or prison if that's a real solution to a problem, whether it's public safety or the safety of someone on the street, or it's the only way to control an individual, including mental health services, mental health, hospitalization, etc. Places where we don't put resources now. Yeah. So I would challenge the point that it was necessary to limit the discretion. We really needed to increase the discretion, but give judges more power to understand what needed to be done in a particular case, and then ask them to do the right thing.
Right. Give the judges more resources, in a way.
Give the courts, yes, the court system more resources, which again comes back to what the defense does. The defense is supposed to be bringing in the alternatives, bringing in the resources, and should be able to say, this person doesn't belong here. We've got a program in the community that will do just as well or better.
Right. So, in what ways are there racial disparities in the system, and how would you make sure that the system is colorblind and is fair in its administration of justice?
Well, that's, needless to say, a real tough one. I want to take accountability somewhat for racial disparity in the system. I worked in the system in Chicago. We knew all of our clients. 95 or 90% of our clients were minority. Most of them were Black. And we understood, we saw that every day. It wasn't until I got to the sentencing project and Mark Maurer came to us and to me and said, I think we've got evidence that shows that 1 in 4 young black men are in trouble in the criminal justice system. And then he got that evidence and published a groundbreaking report out of the sentencing project, which made headlines for weeks in the United States. It was a shock. People denied the reality, looked at the numbers and said, yeah, you're right. One quarter, 25% of young black men are in trouble in the criminal justice system. 5 years later, we did another report, and then it was 1 in 3 more. It had gotten worse, not better. We'd had this tremendous response, but it didn't translate into a change in policies that really solved the problem. So, you know, partly what I've said so far about changing the nature of the court processes would, I think, address some of the racial disparity. But, you know, we're not going to, you know, to really fully address it, you have to go back to the community and you have to go back to where the source of the problem is. And I think this is deep and it involves income disparity, under-resourced communities, and a whole mess of social issues, which I would say goes to the value of the Black Lives Matter movement at this time and this place.
Hey, Malcolm, you described the system that has funneled very large numbers of people into incarceration without, with racial bias and much more, without too much process to identify when and where it's appropriate to do that. But one way or the other, we now have massive incarceration. And however we fix the front end of the process, we still have to deal with the millions of people currently in jail or under supervision. Do you have thoughts about how we can undo that, how we can reduce in an appropriate, a safe, and a humane way, reduce this enormous prison population?
Well, thank you for the question, because I think part of the answer is that's the right question. We've spent decades, and I've been part of this, using grant money and government money to investigate where we can tinker around the edges with the process that will ultimately affect the number of people who go to prison. And to answer your question, I think it's time to go look at the prisons themselves. We should regard prisons as America's Bastille or Gulag. They're something we shouldn't have in our country. They represent the incarceration of more people than for our population than any other developed or any other country really incarcerates. They're shameful. So it's time to go look and see who's in prison and ask the questions, you know, why are they here? What's the reason for keeping them here? And most important, what do we need to do to get them out? And we've done this successfully in at least 2 instances. We did it with President Obama's clemency program and the Clemency 2014 program and work, which FAM and other organizations supported, which ended up getting 1,600 people out, or more than 1,600 people out on clemency as sentence commutations from President Obama. And that was a process of looking at people who were eligible, screened, and then screening them for characteristics, and then moving them forward and recommending them for clemency. And 2 things were significant. One, almost none of those people, some of whom were at life sentences, like Norman Brown, who worked with me in Project New Opportunity, none of those people, or almost none of those people, got into trouble again. And number 2, the United States Sentencing Commission did a study of the clemency program as it operated and of the criteria that the clemency program applied, and determined that there were again as many people still in federal prison who were just as eligible for clemency as had been released by President Obama. In other words, there are more people in there who look just like the people who got out on clemency. And we need to go back and help pull them out. The other effort, which was more under the radar, but actually in fact affected more people, over 30,000, was a downward adjustment of drug sentencing that was approved by the United States Sentencing Commission and then indirectly by Congress, and allowed 30,000 or more individuals to be released months, sometimes years before the end of their sentence. And that actually affected all of these folks were convicted of drug crimes in the federal system. And that affected actually a lot more people than President Obama's clemency did. And again, I've been informed informally that there were some preliminary studies by the United States Probation Department about what happened to these folks. We know anecdotally, very few of them got into serious trouble. So once again, people were let out early in large numbers, and they did pretty well. They did maybe better than people who stayed in longer do. So all this is to say that we should take these programs as lessons and guidance. We should go back and I think prison by prison, see who's there, see who can come out, apply criteria, but be expansive about those criteria, and then ask the question, what do we need to do to successfully bring this person home? And start to work on that before they're released, and then work with them while they're in the process of being released and when they go back to the community. That's what we did at Project New Opportunity. And again, we didn't have a failure. I think this is something that could be institutionalized. It's not going to be done with the present mindset unless something like Black Lives Matter or the Council for Women and Girls who formerly incarcerated, I'm sorry, I don't never get the title right. Get behind something like this and start to advocate at a public policy level in the state government, just as they successfully have argued for reform in policing in many states and many localities. We need that kind of energy to drive an approach that will actually pull people out of prison.
Great, thank you.
So the police chief of the district has often, I've heard him say this a number of times, that one of the reasons that there is so much greater violence in the district is that because people have been released either from jail or prison. He often says that it's people have been released either because they weren't brought to trial yet, and they were out waiting for trial, or because they were in prison and released and they went back to recidivate. So I was wondering how you would respond to him if you heard him say that.
Well, if I had heard him say that when I was asked to respond, I would say that you have to go back before that. Before they came out of prison or were released, they were put into prison. And before they were put into prison, they presumably got into some kind of trouble or were accused of something or convicted of something. You need to go back and start to say, well, what was going on then, and how do we interfere with that, with those actions? Instead of treating this as if, okay, something happens that's bad, and now we have this response, lock them up, and if we let them out, something bad will continue to happen. That's just blinding ourselves to looking at what the nature of the problem is. Now, let me really bear down on this just for a second with one word: guns. Okay, I told you I grew up in Kansas. I wasn't hunting. My father didn't hunt, but I had friends who did, and friends' fathers who did. I was in the military. I had nothing against guns until I became a defense attorney and started to look at autopsy photographs of people who lost their lives to guns and decided they're not a positive force in our communities at this point used in this way. But I don't have anything against guns as weapons, fearful tools. When I was a kid, we were taught, how to hold them, be aware of them. We were taught to be afraid of them, to not treat them casually. So what you do about guns, it's complicated, but it's also been politicized, and we need to get around that. We need to figure out what are we going to do about this problem. And until we have political leaders who are willing to take this on, simply locking somebody up because they're suspected of a shooting or they're afraid they're going to be involved in another shooting or another death is not going to solve the problem. That's just one example. We could include mental health, drug use, and other examples of where we need to look at the problem and try to address it before we have a criminal act.
So let me follow up on that. One more question. We're going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up for questions from our audience. We already have 3 questions that people have asked, so I'll share some of those. But since you mentioned mental health, I guess we'd like just to talk more about the relationship of mental health services to crime and incarceration and reentry.
Well, I think most people are well aware that we had a de-incarceration of mental health institutions back in the 60s and 70s, and that was well intentioned, but we never put the resources into the community that were supposed to go there to really serve folks with mental health issues. And mental health issues, let's just be broad. We're talking about everything from learning disabilities to autistic kids, who can get into trouble in ways that the police are just beginning to learn to understand. So we don't have the resources. We haven't had the resources to treat and address mental health issues, and we use the police and jails as a substitute for that. Every jailer that I know will tell you, jails are the worst place to deal with mental health issues. Chuck, Interfaith Action for Human Rights, works with people who are in isolation, and you've talked to these folks. I've talked to these folks. We're just lay people, but you and I probably would agree. We see a lot of folks with apparent mental health issues and the most severe custody we can impose. So the evidence is there, the research is there, the intellectual backing is there, but the political will has never been there to treat mental health issues in the community the way it needs to be appropriately addressed. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, so tell me what the question was again, if you want.
That was helpful, and it's some of our other interviewees have said basically the same thing. The lack that you never put resources into community and mental health services, and that often the police have no other choice but to put someone in jail when they're acting out in public, because there's no other facility to place them for them to get. We listened to a woman named. I listened to an interview of a woman. I just read her book, Christine Montrose, who's a psychiatrist, has done all this work in the criminal justice system in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And she just said the story that a policeman told her that someone was acting out in public. They brought this person to the hospital, and the hospital said, "Well, we have no beds for this person." And so before they finished the paperwork, this guy was out on the street, and he was acting out again. And so they had to go back, and the only other solution they had was to arrest him and put him in jail, even though that clearly wasn't what this person needed, as using the language you used. And so I think that's we've heard a lot of testimony about that particular issue. And if anyone goes into a prison, which I've done a number of times, it's all kinds of people there with mental health issues. And of course, that just the locking people up, denying their freedom in that way is a terrible way to deal with people who have mental health issues. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions we have.
But Chuck, could I interrupt for a second? Malcolm mentioned, I don't want to hold up the questions too long, but Malcolm mentioned isolation in prison systems, and that's a special interest, a special focus of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. I'd like to ask you, Malcolm, or start by saying prison authorities often state that the deployment of solitary confinement is essential to maintaining security in prisons. What would your response be to the claim that this truly horrendous practice is indispensable?
I think in isolated cases, possibly there's necessary merit to this, but I would share my experience in Illinois. When I went to Illinois had a fairly new prison in Tams, Illinois, called Tams. It was a supermax. It was more supermax than the federal supermax in Colorado, and I visited it twice, 3 times maybe. And while I was in Illinois, there was a group active to try to get TAMS closed. Had about 200 inmates in it. All were in this category of that you described. The corrections people felt they had to remove them from other facilities and put them in a isolation in a supermax setting for the safety and security of the overall institutions or facilities. Well, the advocates were successful, and I was happy to be a small part of that. We were successful in getting TAMS closed, and they moved people back into other prisons and without the supermax facilities. They still kept some of them in isolation or a single celling. And there was no terrible result. There was no bad outcome recorded as a result of closing down TAMS. In addition, even the warden at TAMS would say privately, and the mental health people at TAMS, of whom there were a number and who were pretty good, would say, this is the absolute worst place to treat someone with a mental health, with mental illness, in a place where they're totally isolated, can't see or speak to another person. Even they do group therapy, everybody would be in a phone booth size single unit and have to talk through glass panes. This was cruel and unusual punishment for many people who were just suffering from problems that were not of their own making. And they closed that place down without ill effect. So I would use that as evidence that the claim that we need to have isolation, and we need to use it as much as many prisons do, as in Maryland, is basically, it's not correct. There are alternatives, and it's not, as a general statement, it's not sustainable or supportable. In an individual case, and for limited periods of time, there may be a correctional necessity to totally isolate individuals, but not on the scale that we're doing it at all.
Thank you.
Okay, let me move to a couple of questions we've got from our audience. One has to do with restorative justice. The idea that a community come together to address the individual's needs that drove the infractions of the law, minus the circles of affected victims and the neighborhoods. Do you think there's a possibility of incorporating restorative justice into a redesigned carceral system?
There absolutely should be. And I think one of the disappointments about restorative justice, I've seen restorative justice working in a court setting with violent and nonviolent crimes involved. And so anecdotally, I was blown away. I was impressed at what example, the number of person hours spent on one case of a violent assault by one individual against another one on the street. I totaled up the people involved in the circle, the time was 30 hours to decide what sentence should be applied to this individual. Uh, Compare that to a judge's typical sentencing hearing of less than 20 minutes to decide what should be done. These were a group of people from the community trying to reason out what should be done to solve this problem. I'm a fan of restorative justice. I do not know why it has not caught on to a greater extent than it has. It should be one of the alternatives prior to going to court that should be, people should be able to consider. It's one of the, I didn't name it, but it would be in that 1/3 category. You can do something else with these folks. And where people are injured or damaged, restorative justice can be a very productive outcome. And I just do not understand why it has not caught on and become, a popular alternative. It's rewarding to the people who are involved in it. So that's my answer.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any comments about the private prison system, its effect?
No, I mean, I'm against private prisons. The idea of making money off of prisons, of people buying stock in prisons because the prison population is expected to rise, is just totally anathema to anybody who's American small d Democrat in my mind. But there are many people who have studied and documented and compared private prisons to publicly funded prisons. We had, of course, an experience in District of Columbia. I think there's nothing to recommend private prisons, and it should not be part of the system. It's a public function, but so I agree, but I'm not the authority in the comparison.
Another question about, I'm not sure I understand, enforce mental health resources using disability laws. Oh, I see. Whether the disability laws that we have of respecting, making access for people who have disabilities, either physical or mental, I guess, can mental health resources then be used under the banner of the Disability Act? You have any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I don't really know the answer. If it's a legal question, can that be used? I don't know. Yeah. I know prisons have obtained exemptions from disability rights legislation, but it's a good question. I'm sorry I can't answer it.
Okay, if anybody else in the audience, please feel free to ask some more questions. If you're in the audience, we have some more to ask you, Malcolm, if that's all right. So you've talked about political will here a couple of times and the lack thereof to really, for the lack of leadership then because of the lack of political will on change in our system. So how do we extend these changes? How do we create these changes when there's such a powerful prison industrial complex and law and order politicians who work so hard to prevent such change? How do we address that big issue, if at all?
Well, I mean, that's the question. And I think if we draw on current events, I think the lesson is we can't rely upon the traditional approach or the approach that traditional lawmakers and policymakers have taken. We can't rely on a history of research and more research and evaluation of data, all of which points in the similar direction, but we don't act on it. I think we have to look at the model of the reforms that are being brought about because of the reaction to the George Floyd and other deaths, and in conjunction with the realization during the pandemic that minorities, African Americans in particular, are paying a higher price than the rest of us, than the white majority and people who are wealthy. we need to have that political action carry over to uh, to demand real change in the system, some of which I hope I've touched upon. Not just tweaking around the corners, not just adjusting the guidelines, not just letting people out on parole 15% of the time earlier or increasing the parole eligibility period. No, these changes just touch a few people and don't make a difference in the numbers over, that we want to see. We need a demand for a real solid action. And as I said, my thinking is that people are in prison now. The question about why they're there and what you need to do to get them out should be asked. We have models to do this. The Clemency Project, the Drugs Minus 2 in the federal system. Some states have played around a little bit. We should go after every institution and try to get that population in that institution down, and then start closing institutions and consolidate them. But it's difficult. I would just draw a comparison of something we've learned from the disaster with COVID-19 that this country has had, and the disaster in the last 4 or 5 months, and the disaster we've had with incarceration over the last 5 or 6 decades. I think people have heard that we have 22% of the world's population, 5% of the world's population, and 22% of the COVID-19 cases and 22% of the COVID-19 deaths. And that's a statistic that rings a bell with those of us who worked in criminal justice, because we have 5% of the world's population and we have 25% of the world's imprisoned population. And the reasons that both those catastrophic numbers are realities for the United States of America is because we have a tradition in this country of not paying attention to science, not paying attention to objective information, following passion and political drives that do not reflect the best approach to take. It failed us in criminal justice, and it failed us spectacularly and tragically with the pandemic. And I would just conclude by saying that we need to learn how to stop doing this, because criminal justice and the mass incarceration is a relatively simple problem. You can solve it. We know what to do. We know what to do about the pandemic, but we've got a bigger problem coming down the pike called climate change and increased heating in the world, the effects of climate change. And we don't know what to do about that. And unless we start paying attention to the science, our grandchildren are going to suffer far more than we're suffering now. So we need to learn how to do better. And we should approach it as a desperate need that is greater even than just the cause of reducing incarceration and reducing the pandemic. Need a better America.
You make me think, Malcolm, of some demonstrations in 2017 by American scientists here in DC who were campaigning for a realistic attitude towards science, which they thought would be a key to turning around our political problems. But let me ask you a question about what you've been involved in most recently. In the event that we did manage to take a thoughtful approach to reducing the population in our institutions, we then have to face the question of the obstacles that returning citizens have to overcome in order to integrate into the community. And I think we'd be interested to know what your experience with Project Opportunity has enabled you to learn in that respect.
Well, there were some real positive outcomes in Project New Opportunity. We learned some lessons. I learned a lot of things I hadn't really appreciated. Let me just talk about the value of the individual approach. We know, for instance, that statistically, we know that people coming out of prison tend to be underemployed. They have trouble getting work, and we know there are legal barriers as well as social barriers to employing people who come out of prison, who've been incarcerated. But on the other hand, the group that we worked for, which was not a random selection, about 40% of our clients felt they had jobs lined up when they came out of prison. And our job was to confirm those impressions. And sometimes they were a little overly optimistic, but a significant number of people coming out of prison that we worked with felt they had a beat on a job through a friend, through a family member, or just through a contact, and did. And so the lesson was, for that person, we didn't need to focus on the question of jobs. We need to focus on other questions like family reunification, or whether there was an addiction issue. Usually there wasn't, whatever the problem was. So problems like the obstacles in employment are there and real, and we need to resolve them. We need to resolve the legal obstacles. And there are some groups that have been very effective in spelling out how to do this. But we also need to recognize that not all these problems affect everybody, and that you can work with individuals. There are people who work around, there are people who use their talents and skills and come out and do get jobs and do get good work. It's not always easy. So, there are successes. But yes, the legal barriers need to be resolved. The problem, and I'll just say, I have difficulty with some of them. I'm always wary of getting rid of the record of convictions. It's a real good effort, but in today's world, an employer can go online and get record of someone's conviction, even if it's been expunged. So what do you tell your client if they're going for a job? Say you weren't convicted because it's been expunged, and then if it shows up you were convicted, they'll consider you're a liar and they won't hire you. Or be honest and say I was convicted, but it was expunged, and run the risk of not getting a job. These are terrible, weighty issues, and I think one answer to them is the more we get into looking at who's in prison, and what they look like, and why they can in fact come out, the more people will understand that, there are a lot of resources. There are a lot of smart people coming out. There are a lot of people in prison who want to come out and do well. You give them a chance, you give them help, you solve some of the problems step by step, they're going to perform very, very well for you as an employer, and well in their community and their family. We need to help people understand that the people we're putting in prison don't look that much different, by and large, from many other people who aren't in prison. And many of them don't look like that much different from people you may have in your family or in your neighborhood. That's certainly the case in my situation. And then, so let's solve their problem, help them move forward, and get them out of these institutions and stop putting them in, because we're not doing them or us any good.
There are two other questions here from the audience. I'd like to get to them before we conclude. What impact has jail ministries played in the healing and restorative process with inmates? Do you have any experience with that?
Well, just anecdotally, I've talked to many people who benefited, or said they benefited, or let you know without blowing somebody's horn about it, that they benefited from contact with jail ministries, with people who reached them through jail ministries. I think, anecdotally, it's like a lot of other things. There are some people for whom spiritual counseling, or the guidance of someone who's in a religious position or teaching is valuable and needed, and that works for some folks, and so of course we want to encourage that. Things like mentorship and sponsorship, some things work for some people and some things work for other people and not for the first group, and the trick is to match up and get the resources to the right people, and then let them work with it.
Thanks for that. Another question is about, do you believe that those incarcerated should retain the right to vote? And should there be a national law that reinstitutes the right to vote as soon as they are released?
Well, for what it's worth, yes, I do believe that. I mean, yes. I think, again, people, it helps people to have a stake in their society.
Yeah. And the fact is that now DC residents who are incarcerated have a right to vote while they're incarcerated. So
Yes, and that's a tremendous advance, and implementation is going to be a challenge because of the relationship with the Bureau of Prisons in particular. But it's a terrific step, and it's a great accomplishment. And I think the Sentencing Project and some other local groups had a good bit to play in that.
Yeah, and we have a pen pal project, and we've been in touch with the Sentencing Project that they would send us a flyer with some information that we could send out to all our pen pals, how they could go about registering. One last question from the audience. What is your response to the Black Lives Matter statement that the root of our criminal justice system, particularly in the South, is an extension of a system to control runaway slaves? Is that legacy still apparent today in 2020? That may apply to arrest, and does it apply to the prison system?
Well, I think historically it does. I mean, I certainly understand that. I've heard that, but I know with certainty from work that I've done that it applies very much to the way prisons have been used to exploit prison labor and to provide prison services, if you will, or prisoner services to local jurisdictions for free, a form of enslavement, and even the prison industries. The history of prison industries is flavored by a preference and originated with a preference in southern prisons to employ, in quotation marks, prisoners on public projects and public works projects, and for historically employ prisoners for private enterprise as well. So in that sense, it's an extension of that aspect of slavery.
Right. Okay, I think I'll ask my last question. I think Ed knows the one I like to ask. And this is kind of one of the reasons I feel strongly about all these issues. What makes me angry, especially, is how narrow our sense of holding people accountable is in our country. In the sense that what can be done to hold bad actors in the system accountable when they become corrupt or undermine or break the law, such as the police or prosecutors when they hold exculpatory evidence from the defense, things like that. How can we bring greater accountability throughout the criminal justice system?
Well, there's a lot in there, Chuck. The prosecutors withholding evidence, why we have a system that basically in almost there's been an appellate decision after appellate decision that has reversed decisions because the appellate courts found that prosecutors concealed or did not disclose evidence to defendants, and almost zero prosecutions or disciplinary actions by bar associations against the prosecutors who engaged in that conduct. There have been many instances of prosecutors manufacturing or using manufactured evidence and not revealing that, and the disciplinary actions, and certainly no criminal prosecutions against those folks. And so again, I don't know what you do about that other than I think the most powerful voice is the voice of people. So you come to Black Lives Matter, and you come to the recent experience with advocates for justice reform in the streets, literally, and you identify these practices and you say that's enough. We won't have them. Now there are as a result of people voting, there are some reform prosecutors in place in hopefully in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in other jurisdictions, that were elected to correct some of these practices, and there are prosecutors who've taken on some of these practices. So you shouldn't, paint prosecutors with too broad a brush, but it's, what prosecutors don't want to adopt these standards, it's difficult, and I think it takes public opinion and public demand to do so. I think most people need to realize that the criminal justice system is not our answer to inappropriate, wrongful, illegal conduct in many senses. A very small portion of non-homicide criminal offenses are even prosecuted or prosecutable. We have to use other elements, other parts of society to regulate and control and guide behavior. And voting people in and out of office is one way to do it. Public recognition, condemnation by religious groups, or highlighting, that something is unethical by religious standards. There are other ways to call to account people who transgress. The criminal justice system is not the only one, and it starts way down. It starts in the schools and communities. If you can get a kid to realize they shouldn't be taking things from a store, the way most of our kids did at one time or the other, you don't get into the criminal justice system. You just have a kid that starts to act right and build from that.
Right. Well, with that, I think we'll bring this interview to a close. I want to thank Malcolm Young again for being available to answer all these questions and to give such a very persuasive view about what could be done about how to end mass incarceration in the sense of reducing the numbers of people in prison and how that can be done.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity, you and Ed, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate the discussion. I hope some folks have found it interesting or useful, and will look to the day when we can really get people out of prisons and close some of those facilities down.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for your work in that direction, Malcolm.
Thank you.
So, and I want to thank Christine Callenberry, my associate, who's been behind the scenes here. She'll stop the recording now, and we will post this recording of this interview on our website within the next day or so. So I want to say thank you, everybody, and I think we can say goodbye to everybody. So have a great day. Stay well. Stay safe.
Thank you.